welcome all of you here this evening. This is the 18th Bessie Lecture sponsored by the Department of Botany and a number of co-sponsoring departments. This evening, as long as we don't have any loud cheering from the back, we're going to have Professor Charles Heiser present a talk on botanical aspects of the Columbian exchange of plants and animals during the time of earliest exploration here in the New World. Professor Heiser, we're indeed fortunate to have on campus here today. He is clearly one of the distinguished botanists in this country today. He got his bachelor's and master's degrees at Washington University in St. Louis in a co-administered program with the Missouri Botanical Garden. He then headed west as a young man, and in 1947 received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. At the same time, he did a little bit of teaching out at University of California, Davis, and was very strongly influenced by Ledyard Stebbins. He then, upon completion of his PhD, moved to Indiana University, where he has been extremely successful ever since. This was in 1947. He put in 39 years as an exemplary professor of botany in that institution, and in 1986 he retired as a distinguished professor emeritus. Dr. Heiser's research has centered primarily around our understanding, or trying to understand, how plants of economic importance evolved, both in their natural settings and under the influence of humans. So his interests are very broad. However, his primary foci of his studies centered around a few groups, namely the sunflowers, the genus Helianthus, the genus Capsicum in the Solanaceae, the potato-tomato family, and in fact the genus Solanum. He continues that work and enjoys that work yet in his retirement. As a teacher, he has produced over 50 graduate students, 30 of which are PhDs. And today, many of these PhDs are at the top of their fields, respectively. For instance, Gregory Anderson is president-elect of the Botanical Society of America. Peter Bredding is on campus here in our plant introduction station. Ed Schilling is the director or the editor of Systematic Botany. So his influence in his students continues to perpetuate long after his active participation in Indiana University teaching. He has, as a scholar, been an author of over 150 scientific research papers. He has written 5 books, primarily centering around economically important plants. He has also served in a leadership capacity in a number of scientific societies, serving as president of the Botanical Society of America, the American Society of Plant Taxonomists, the Society for Economic Botany, and the Society for the Study of Evolution. He is clearly a leader in this field and has been recognized as such by the awarding of a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Asa Gray Award, awarded in 1988 by the American Society of Plant Taxonomists in recognition of his many accomplishments in systematics, the Merit Award of the Botanical Society of America, and in 1987 he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. And we're quite happy to have him here on campus. We would like to thank a number of participating departments in bringing him here. Namely, if you'll please bear with me, there's a lot of interest in Dr. Heiser's seminar on campus. The Departments of Agriculture, Engineering, Agronomy, Animal Ecology, Animal Science, Anthropology, the Biology Program, the Botany Department, Botany Organization of Graduate Students, Entomology, Food Science and Human Nutrition, Forestry, History, Horticulture, Plant Pathology, Zoology and Genetics, the USDA Plant Introduction Station, the Graduate College, and we would especially like to thank the Committee on Lectures for their participation in the publicity of Professor Heiser's lecture this evening. We are indeed happy to have him here, and without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Heiser and the title of his talk this evening, The Plants and Animals of the Columbian Exchange, 1492 to 1550. Mr. Heiser?
Thank you very much. I'm indeed pleased to be invited here to give the Bessie Lecture. And I would like to start by saying that I didn't come to praise Columbus nor to damn him, but I want to talk about this great exchange of plants that began with his first voyage to the Americas. Probably the greatest exchange of plants between the Old World and the New World that ever occurred. And this took place largely in the few years following Columbus's voyages. Before 1492, only 3 domesticated plants had crossed the oceans. And the bottle gourd, which we'll see in the first slide, native to Africa, was well established in the Americas. And the coconut, native to southeastern Asia and the Pacific Islands, was found on a few places on the coast of Central America. And the sweet potato, which was domesticated in tropical America, was present on some of the Pacific Islands when the Spanish arrived there. Both the bottle gourd and the coconut have fruits that float, and they possibly floated across the ocean. It has been shown that both will germinate after long periods in salt water, but we can't say the same for the sweet potato. And probably the most likely explanation is that early Polynesian voyagers carried the sweet potato from South America to the Pacific Islands. Now, there are some people who believe that other domesticated organisms also crossed the oceans previous to Columbus's voyages, but I do not find the evidence very convincing. Today, or tonight, I shall concentrate on those domesticated plants and animals that cross the ocean intentionally, because many other organisms made the crossing unintentionally. Many diseases, many animals, such as insects and rats, and of course weeds. About 50% of our weeds in the northern states come from the Old World, about 35% of them from Europe. Now, we have given them some weeds in return, but far fewer. And with a few exceptions which I've noted, it all began with Columbus. Although he knew that he was looking for spices, he was not particularly knowledgeable about plants. And in one place in his writings, he expressed regret that he didn't know more. However, he was obsessed with gold. He didn't have time to learn about plants. And of course, he was not alone in his interest in gold, nor in making slaves of the Indians. But I should point out it was the plants that were discovered that was proved far more valuable than all the gold that ever came out of the New World. Columbus does mention a few plants in his writings, but our best early record of the American plants comes from one Fernandez de Oviedo y Valdez, usually called Oviedo, who went to Panama in 1514 as an official of the crown and later lived for many years in Santo Domingo. When Columbus arrived in the West Indies, he found that the Indians cultivated a large number of plants. And the domesticated plants and the people as well of the West Indies, this is the area I'll be speaking about most of the time, but the plants and the animals apparently came from northern South America, and the people. And of course, many other plants were later found in Mexico and in South America and the other parts of the New World. Corn, as it's known in Iowa, I think, and Indiana, or maize, as it's more properly called, from the Indian name. And I shall use the word that Columbus used for the Native Americans. He called them Indians. In fact, he's the one that started it. It's shorter than Native Americans. And maize was the New World plant that was to travel most rapidly around the world. It was not of great significance in the West Indies, however, and it wasn't until the Spanish reached the mainland that they found that this was the major food source of the American Indians. At this time, it was already being cultivated from southern Canada to southern South America. And it was first illustrated in an herbal, the Herbal of Fuchs, in 1542. That is not the illustration, but that shows corn for sale in a market in Ecuador. And there is the first drawing of the corn plant. And here he called it Turkish corn, for he thought it came from Asia. And he was not the last to do so, for some people still maintain that maize, although American in origin, went to Asia before it reached Europe. And 2 years ago, there was a paper in Journal of Economic Botany in which goddesses are shown holding ears of what appear to be maize on a 13th century temple in India. There is the illustration, and it does, I admit, look remarkably like an ear of corn, but I still remain skeptical, and I don't think the last word has been in, is come in. Corn, of course, soon became a very important crop in many parts of the old world, as it still is today. The basic food plant in the islands was not maize, but bitter manioc. This is a plant that's also known as yucca or cassava, and a plant that is very little known in this country, and when it is, it's generally known in the form of tapioca. But today, a lot of people don't even know tapioca. It's a wonderful yielder of carbohydrates. Here are the roots. And cassava bread made from this starch soon became the principal food of the Spaniards in the New World, and it was to prove the best food for outfitting ships for the return voyage to Europe. And it became practically the only food supplied to the Indians working in the gold mines, and it probably contributed to many of their deaths, because although it gives a full belly, it's woefully lacking in protein, about 1% protein. Starts of the plants were soon carried to Europe, and they did not do well there, but they soon found homes in both Africa and Asia, and today both of these places produces far more of this plant than does the Americas. The sweet potato was second only to manioc as a food, and the leaves as well as the roots were eaten. There are two main types of sweet potatoes, sweet ones and starchy ones. And some of these are sometimes called yams in the United States, but the true yam is a completely different plant. And for unexplained reasons, when the sweet potato reached Europe, it was considered an aphrodisiac, which probably increased its popularity. But it was Asia where it became most widely accepted, and today over 90% of the world's crop is grown there. China is the leading producer, and Japan is also very important. In Japan, it's second in importance only to rice, and it's considered typhoon insurance, for the sweet potato roots are safe underground when the rice crop is destroyed. Common beans, which you know from my garden there, and here's a scene from Mexico. common beans were found in cultivation in the Antilles, but like maize, it was to prove to be far more important in the Mexico and South America. The beans were somewhat more familiar to the Spanish than many of these other plants because they had bean-like plants in Europe, particularly the Windsor broad bean. However, the American beans are superior, and they were soon to assume a dominant position in the world. And the common beans were soon followed by lima beans and red runner beans. The other member of the bean family that they found here was the peanut. And this plant appeared very unusual to them because it produced its seeds underground. There's a somewhat similar plant that occurs in Africa, but I don't think the Spanish were aware of it. Later, the peanut was to become particularly important in Asia, and India alone produces 4 times as much as the Americas today. Squash and pumpkins were new to the Spanish. There are peanuts being harvested in Ecuador. Squash and pumpkins were new to the Spanish. Melons were known for Europe, but squashes and pumpkins were indigenous to the Americas. Those in the West Indies, however, were not the ones that were first identified in Europe. Although I think these were probably carried to Europe, it was a Mexican species that is first figured in the herbal drawing of 1542. And there we have it, and that is a type that is still common in Mexico and, of course, widely grown in the United States. I'll have an explanation for this shortly. Although Columbus never found the spices that he was seeking, he did discover others. Peter Martyr tells us that he found peppers more pungent than those of the Caucasus. These, of course, being black pepper. 3 different fruit types were found of peppers in the West Indies. This is a species showing the great variation in it that occurs widely in South America. 3 of these types, small oval one, an elongate one like that, and one similar to this. 3 types were found in the West Indies. And most likely they were carried to Spain, but they're not heard of again in Europe. And we find that Fuchs in the herbal that I described earlier describes 3 kinds as occurring in Germany in 1542. And these are the chili peppers, which must have come from middle of America. Here's the illustration. And so the question comes up, how did the peppers from the Americas, from Mexico, we can understand from the West Indies, how did those species from Mexico, such as the squash and the pepper, get to Europe so early? Some people think they would not have arrived until after Cortez went to Mexico in 1519. But some people overlook that they could have come from Honduras or Costa Rica following Columbus's trip there. Columbus was the discoverer of Costa Rica on a trip there in 1502. His son Ferdinand, who was 13 years old at the time, tells us of encountering a canoe off the coast of Central America loaded with 25 people and all kinds of food. Apparently the Indians were taking these to a food fair. Now, we have another person on the voyage who also gives this account. I'm not sure you'd want to trust a 13-year-old boy. So apparently I would suggest, at least, that many of these foods were seized. The people and the contents of the boat were seized. And although neither peppers nor squash were mentioned, I think it's likely they could have been collected at that time and made their way to Europe. This was also the occasion of their first encounter with cacao, or chocolate beans. which at that time was not only being eaten, but also used for currency in Middle America. Here are chocolate beans or cacao beans for sale in a market in Oaxaca, Mexico. The Spaniards in Mexico didn't appreciate chocolate at first, apparently because the Indians didn't sweeten it. They spiced it with other things, including chili pepper. I might say that in addition to peppers, which I've been discussing, vanilla was a second spice that came from the Americas. It's the only food product that I know of that comes from an orchid, and this, of course, is still being grown in Mexico and Central America, but most of the production of vanilla is from the orchid that's grown in Madagascar. I should go beyond that and say most vanilla is made synthetically today, but you can still get natural vanilla from plant sources. The third important spice to come from the Americas was the plant which we know as allspice, or pimienta, and this is from a plant in Jamaica. And although most of these slides are my own, I must acknowledge Dr. Bredding for this slide, for I've never been to Jamaica. Later, the Spaniards also found this tree growing wild in Mexico. It was not at that time cultivated, as I understand it, but they collected the fruits from wild trees in Jamaica and on the mainland. But let me return to chocolate for a moment. There is a plant of cacao growing in Ecuador. Once they learned to sweeten it, it became a favorite drink of the Spaniards. There are the pods in which the seeds are found. And after the conquest of Mexico, shipment of the beans, of the cacao beans, began to Spain. And by 1525, cacao was being cultivated in Trinidad and Venezuela. Now, cacao is native to South America, but it was not in cultivation until the Spanish introduced it into these countries. It's still a very important crop in tropical America, but today, West Africa produces more than does the Americas. By far, the fruit that excited the most attention was the pineapple. And the Spaniards found that the Indians, in addition to enjoying the fruits, made a wine from it. Columbus did not do this, but on a later voyage, pineapples were sent to the King of Spain. Most of them spoiled on the trip, but apparently some reached there in good shape. And it was rapidly carried to other parts of the world. The Spanish carried it to the Philippines as soon as that country was conquered. The Portuguese carried it to Africa, and it was in India by 1550. It's amazing how rapidly some of these plants moved. And pineapples were so popular that there were specially constructed greenhouses in England so that they could grow them. Pineapples do not do very well in the ordinary English climate. Probably second to popularity among the fruits of the New World was the papaya, the tree that produces melons. And the papayas were not in the West Indies when Columbus was there. There's some question about that, but that seems to be, that's my conclusion at least from studying the early historical record. And I don't think Columbus ever saw it, but it was growing in Panama and Venezuela, and Columbus, of course, never explored either of these countries very extensively. The tomato, seen here in the Mexican market, is today one of the world's most important vegetables, although, as you know, it is a fruit, and it also had not yet reached the West Indies. Although all wild tomatoes are native to South America, the tomato was domesticated in Mexico. I won't be able to go into detail, but the Spanish first encountered it when they arrived in Mexico, and we find no early mention of it in Spain. And the first definite record from Europe is from Italy in 1544, which is fairly late. Some people think that the tomato may have gone first to North Africa, where it was at one time called, it was called Pomo dei Mori, or Moor's apple, and some of the earliest tomatoes grown in Italy had yellow fruits. Now, these are not unusual. You can get these from most of the seed companies, Northrop King and so on today. But they were called at the time Pomi de Oro, or golden apples. However, one or other of these names, either Pomo de Mori, Moor's apple, or Pomme de Oro, golden apple, became transformed into Pomme d'amour, or love apple, in France. And from that we get our English name, love apple. And because of this name, some people in France attached aphrodisiac properties to the tomato. But as one Frenchman who tested it sadly reported, it wasn't true. Or so the story goes. A plant that reached Europe much later rivals maize in its importance and yields more calories per acre than does any of the cereals. This is the Irish potato, or the sweet potato, seen in flower there in the high Andes. When the Spanish arrived, its cultivation was confined to the South American highlands, and they thought indeed it a strange food, comparing it to truffles. And the potato was first recorded in Spain in 1570 and in England in 1590, and it came to North America from Europe in 1718. The English herbalist John Gerard had good things to say about it in 1597, quite early. But like the tomato, it was slow to gain acceptance in Europe. Perhaps because many people recognized its affinities with plants that were known to be deadly poisonous, such as deadly nightshade, belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. However, in fact, at a little later time, a Presbyterian minister preached that had God intended the potato for food, it would have been mentioned in the Bible. And we all know it isn't. However, encouraged by royalty in some countries, the potato slowly gained acceptance and became one of the most important food plants in Europe, and a plant that was to play a prominent part in history, no more so than in Ireland. The potato had become the principal and nearly the only food of the Irish. They consumed 12 to 14 pounds a day. Then in 1845, the potato blight struck, fungal disease, wiping out the crop, or virtually wiping out the crop, causing great suffering, deaths, and mass immigration, with great consequences on the population of Boston and on the political life and on the police forces in the United States. The potato is now the world's 5th largest crop, and most of it is grown in Europe. The USSR, this was written some months ago, produces or did produce 4 times as much as the United States. I think we can say did produce. The Spanish also encountered cotton in the West Indies. And this plant, that's a potato harvest in the Andes, and the yellow-flowered plant there is a mustard. This is a weed that came over from Europe. The Spanish also encountered cotton, and this is a plant that should have been familiar to them. I'm not sure it was, but the Moors had introduced cotton technology to Spain in the 10th century because there were two species in the Old World of domesticated cotton, which were fairly widely grown. But in the Americas, the species were quite different. Columbus's men did not know that. There's the cotton market, finished product among the Otavalo Indians in Ecuador. Two American species of cotton were domesticated, one in South America and one in Mexico, and these were found to have a superior fiber to those of the Old World, and today nearly all the cotton grown in the world are from the American species, primarily the Mexican one. Native smoking tobacco were observed on Columbus's first voyage, but there is still no agreement on what species of tobacco was being cultivated in the West Indies. This is the Nicotiana tobacco. This is the tobacco that's widely cultivated around the world today. But there are two species, this species and a second species, which is sometimes called wild tobacco, although it's also cultivated, which has a very different type flower. This is a tobacco that was being cultivated in many parts of the Americas, including the eastern North America. Both of these filthy weeds soon spread around the world with great rapidity, and they have sometimes been referred to as the Indians' revenge, although other people would reserve that for a disease which we call syphilis. In Virginia, the English began cultivating the wild tobacco, this one we see here, which was grown by the eastern North American Indians, but this tobacco couldn't compete with the other species being grown in the West Indies by the Spanish, and so not until seeds of the Cuban tobacco was smuggled into Virginia did the tobacco empire begin there, and as we know, it is still widely cultivated in the southern United States. However, today the world's leading producer of tobacco is China, and they produce 4 times as much as the United States. There are, of course, many other minor plants and some major ones which cross the ocean much later. I must mention a few of these. Certainly the sunflower, a plant that's occupied my research attention for over 25 years. It reached Europe in 1560. However, it didn't come either from Mexico or the West Indies, but from what is now the United States. This is the only important cultivated plant that was ever domesticated in what is now the United States. And it now ranks as the 3rd most important oil crop in the world, and most of that production is again from the USSR, or what was the USSR. I should also mention avocado, which at the time of the discovery was being grown both in Peru and Mexico. Several nuts were also indigenous to the Americas. I have time to mention only one of the most important, and that is the cashew, seen here. And that's the way I saw it in the market in Costa Rica. And this is the cashew apple. It's a fleshy part. And that's the part it's being sold there for, because the people suck the juice out of that and it's used as a fruit. And the nut part is frequently thrown away. But in other parts of the world, it is the nut rather than the fleshy stalk that is the more important part. Now, let me turn very briefly to animals, because I realize that Dr. Bessie was a botanist, but I feel we should mention these as well. There were very few domesticated animals in America at the time of the discovery. I think only a half a dozen. And dogs were present, and that's obviously a ceramic dog because they're extinct now, the true American dog, I think. The thing that impressed the Spanish most about these dogs is that they were barkless. Obviously that one is. And they were also very small. But more than that was that they were delicious to eat. And that's why the Indians had so many of them. And according to the noted geographer Carl Sauer, the native dog in Mexico was nearly eaten to extinction by the Spanish. Although once it was thought that the dog came with people from Asia to the Americas, I think it now seems likely that the dog was independently domesticated in the Americas. In other words, dogs had more than one origin, certainly at least one in the Old World, and again at least one in the New World. The ancestor of the dog is the wolf, and we know that wolves are native both to Asia and to North America. The Muscovy duck was present in the Antilles and soon made way to Europe. This is a domesticated bird, of course. It's now found all over the world, but nowhere does it rival the Old World mallard for use as meat. Guinea pigs were an important food source in the Americas. There are some for sale in a market for you to take home and roast. And but if you don't, you could buy them roasted in the market too. It took me a long time to try to eat those. I finally did, and they're not bad. But it always looked to me like roasted rats. And they were eaten in Europe after they were first introduced, but they soon stopped that. And now around the world, except in the Andes, where they're still an important food, they're mostly pets or laboratory animals. Llamas and alpacas, and these are llamas, and I find it very difficult to tell them apart. And these are alpacas. Llamas were particularly valued as beasts of burden, and also for meat, and also for religious ceremonies. And they are still important there. And alpacas were used in the similar way, but they've never been very successful in other parts of the world, although in recent years we find they're doing quite well in the United States, and I believe there are now maybe over 10,000 llamas in this country where they serve as pack animals or as pets. Now for your examination, is that a llama or an alpaca? And also, how many are there? That's one reason I retired early, so I'd never have to give another exam. Those are alpacas, and there's two there, one quite young, and they're getting its meal. The only American domesticated animal to assume any great importance in the Old World was the turkey. And I'm not going into why it's called turkey, because it's still not solved, but some people at that time thought they came from Turkey, like maize and some of the plants. The Spaniards found it in Middle America, so I thought it appropriate I include a picture from Oaxaca, and they introduced it to the West Indies from Mexico. And from there, the first one went to Spain in 1518, where it was presented to the king. We have no record of what his expression was when he saw it. Soon the Americas were to be well supplied with domesticated animals. Cattle, horses, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens, all of them coming with Columbus's voyages. I think nearly all of them came on the second voyage. They all proved to be very successful, so much so that in many parts of the Americas, the animals escaped and became wild or feral, as they still are, for example, pigs in the southern United States, goats in other parts, and horses in our own western United States exist in a feral state. Pigs multiplied most rapidly, and they didn't look anything like those. Those are Iowa pigs, I think. And the pigs were taken to, that's the way I think the more like the pigs of the time. These pigs were taken to the southern United States by DeSoto when he came here in 1538, and they escaped to give rise to the razorback hogs still alive there. Of course, the way I see them most often in South America is like that. Cattle also did very well. They reached Mexico in 1521, and they were in Peru in 1539. And in that same year, there were already ranches with 150,000 head of cattle in Mexico. The Texas Longhorn stems from some of these early escaped Spanish cattle. These early Spanish cattle did remarkably well in the Americas, but they did not do as well in some of the lowland tropical areas as did the Indian cattle or the zebu, which were introduced at a much later date and which you see in parts of our southern states and over much of the lowland tropics today. Leather became as important as the meat, and soon huge amounts of leather were being shipped to Europe. And oxen soon became important work animals, as they still are today in parts of Latin America. Horses were used to take care of the cattle, usually not in this way, but in other ways. But before that, they were of great significance in the conquest. This is not a statue for the horse, and I don't know who it is upon him, but it might well be because they certainly helped the Spanish subdue the Indians. Indians' initial reaction was great fear, and justly so. But eventually the horse was to change the culture of the Indian more so than any other animals, as we well know from our own western United States. I should also mention that once that on occasions the Spanish had to resort to eating their horses when they ran out of food, as happened in some of the expeditions to the continent. Donkeys were also very early introduced, and they're still very important in many Latin American countries. And with both donkeys and horses present, soon we also had mules. I won't explain that. After the conquest of the Philippines, it was mule train that carried the riches of the Philippines from Acapulco to Veracruz for shipment to Spain. And today, of course, it's the sheep that are probably more important to the Indians than most of these other animals, particularly, for example, in our own Southwest. Next to the horse, the dog was the most important animal in conquering the Indians. Columbus took 20 dogs, mastiffs, and greyhounds on his second dogs. These weren't the little Native American dogs. These were huge dogs. Dogs had been trained to kill Moors in Spain, and soon they were doing the same to the Indians. I don't know if the dogs were armed, but these were from pictures of some of the European dogs trained for battle. I will spare you all the gory details of what happened in the America with the introduction of these dogs, but they're written up in a recent book called The Dogs of the Conquest by John and Jeanette Varner. And you'll find a lot of scenes like that. More dogs followed on later voyages, and they were allowed to fend for their own for food, which of course rapidly led to a depletion of the wildlife in some areas, and of course they frequently ate the Indians they killed. Now the other animal that came over, the chicken, George Carter, another geographer, maintains that the chicken was already in South America, having come from Asia before the arrival of the Spanish. And that's the kind of chicken that would have been introduced. That's the same species as our chicken, but this is the Indian or Thai form of the chicken. Carter's argument is that the chicken was already present in some places in South America when the Spanish reached there. I think this simply means that chicken traveled by trade in South America faster than the Spanish did by foot or on horseback. As the same thing happened to watermelon in the Southwest. In many places in Arizona, the Spanish found the Indians growing watermelons. This plant had to come from the Old World. It was not an American plant. Well, until chicken bones are recovered by archaeologists, and are dated as being pre-Columbian, I will remain skeptical. In any event, chickens were reintroduced by Columbus even if they were already here. Although Columbus brought some seed with him on his first voyage, we are not sure that they were ever planted. Although I do recall reading somewhere that they did plant seeds of melons on the first voyage, and that on their return, the second voyage, they ate these melons. They harvested the fruits. Maybe this is just another one of the many myths that have grown up around Columbus, because apparently nearly all the edible seeds that were taken over on the first voyage and left there were eaten by the people that Columbus left in the Americas to establish the colony, because they all starved to death, so we suppose all the seeds were eaten. And it was again the second voyage of Columbus